dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now let me introduce my guest. Good afternoon from our studio in Amsterdam. Before I introduce our very, very special guest, just some housekeeping explanation for those of you who are not familiar with this system. If you need to make a comment or ask a question, just type it in the lower right-hand corner in the comments and question area. If you want to clap or you find something funny or brilliant, there are 3 emojis for that, and the system will register that. If you need to send a private message to anyone in the chat area, just click on the People tab at the top and you can see who's there, and just move your mouse over their name and a window will pop up and you'll be able to send them a private message. So I'm really thrilled today because I finally got to meet a few weeks ago John Klug, who I've been following for about 45 years. John, when some people take on a tough job and, maybe try to sell advertising, John wants to fix the refugee problem worldwide. And he's doing an amazing job. So, John, I would prefer that you kind of give some background on the audience who are not familiar with you. They're from a different planet. So who are you and what are you trying to do with refugees?
Thanks so much, Robert. And thank you all for joining today. I'm still trying to answer that question, who am I? I think many of us are. It's a lifelong pursuit. But I was born in New York. I live on a farm in Central Virginia now. And I kind of split my time between helping to lead the Refugee Investment Network, which we'll talk about in a bit, and a net zero meadery. We make honey wine here. But life is very interesting. I've been a social entrepreneur most of my adult professional life, trying to figure out how best to use my time and resources to improve life here on this blue dot, and try and make a career out of it. Not sure how it's going, but that's at least the goal. I ran a social enterprise in water and sanitation for about 5 years called Toilet Hackers. And then that sort of was absorbed into something called the Toilet Board Coalition. And Toilet Hackers, in many ways, is a little bit similar to the work of the Refugee Investment Network, in that we were building a marketplace in a way, and building a field or a community. And I've also been, had my hand in other cookie jars like cybersecurity and just the general impact investing space. But always looking at different challenges and thinking about how we can work together to creatively solve them. So happy to be here today and explore with all of you.
Most people, when they think refugees, they see problems, expenses, hassles, crime. A guy ran for president based on the whole refugee story. So you're trying to communicate that this is actually an asset, refugees.
Look, people who are displaced are people, their families, their husbands, their wives, their daughters, brothers, cousins. Some of them are, entrepreneurs, some of them are not. but they're people at the end of the day, and they've experienced really horrible things, and they deserve a second shot. I am here actually in this masterclass in a way, a very long threaded way, because of two very resilient people, and also the generosity that others showed them at one point in their lives to start over. And that's my mom and dad. My dad was born in Chemnitz, Germany, lost his father during World War One, and he was incredibly impoverished. They were as a family, and would have been either conscripted or more likely killed during the rise of the Nazi Reich, if he had not fled to the United States, and was given a chance to start a new life here with his mom. And the same thing was true for my mother, who fled Iraq after the '58 revolution. So while my dad wasn't formally recognized as a refugee, I have no doubt that would have been part of his fate if he had stayed a little while longer. And my mom, I mean, their relatives and friends were being hung in the street. So it's a personal thing as well. And I think that we experience displacement, those of us who are not displaced, in terms of a narrative from two places, and that either tends to be the mainstream media, whether Western or otherwise, right, print or digital, or from political talk shops. And that includes those who are running for office and trying to use whatever they can. Everyone always loves to find a scapegoat. But those narratives, the prevailing narratives around refugees and displacement, tend to be one out of fear, which you've articulated, which largely comes from that which we do not understand, or one of extraordinary vulnerability. And it is not untrue that many refugees, in the moment of flight, the period at which they have been propelled from their home or their home country to seek safety somewhere else, in that moment, there is acute vulnerability. But that is really where the narrative tends to fixate. And it fixates on images of people who are crossing oceans or seas, those who are crossing rivers or boundaries with very little except the clothes on their back. And I think we all know that story. And so from a business or investment perspective, you think, well, this is a humanitarian issue. These people are extraordinarily vulnerable, or we don't know them, so we don't trust them. It's antithetical to the context of business or investment in many ways. On the other hand, those are largely false narratives. And from a fear perspective and safety perspective, it's extremely true. There has not been a single act of terrorism in the United States, for example, despite us resettling over 3 million people over the last 30 years, that has been perpetrated by someone who has come here as a refugee. So it's not what you hear from those in the political realm, because that the truthful narrative doesn't actually fit with their objectives, which is to find a boogeyman who's from far away that people can blame. The stories that I hear and the stories that I see and know are very different. It's of people who are fleeing from somewhere to get to somewhere else. And usually, that's the last resort. No one really wants to leave their home. And that is true today. And it was true in 1951 when the Convention for Refugees was created by the United Nations. But there's a huge difference today in someone's displacement experience than when we designed these policies, 50, 60, now 70 years ago. And at the end of World War II, most people got to go home or they were resettled within a period of 5 years. I'm curious if you or anyone in the audience wants to guess what the average time someone is displaced today from their home country. You want to throw a number out there?
A year and a half?
Try 26 years.
Whoa.
And most people think still, even if you're displaced for 5 years or 8 years, that you're going to go home. But the average duration of a conflict today is 8 years. And that even when a conflict ends, take Ukraine, for example, if Russia went home tomorrow, there are cities that just don't exist anymore. So the idea that someone can suddenly go back and have a place to live in, or that it's safe, or if you look at northern Iraq, people from Mosul who fled to Kurdistan for safety during the Iraq War and the rise of ISIS, there are neighbors still living in Mosul next to their homes that turned in their brother and said was a sympathizer of the United States or something like that. So they would have to move back to people that put their family in harm's way. And that's a very, very complicated and difficult thing to do. So we have to understand that most people are, once they're displaced, it's going to be for a long time. And that's a very different paradigm than post-World War II. And these are people that are, they're eager to contribute and to just be a person. But they are trapped in like this horrible extended waiting room of life where they're not really given the full right to become a citizen of wherever they end up, and they can't go home. And so many are just sort of waiting. And what I mean by that is they literally are not given the right to work in most cases. They're not given the right to move or to practice any of the basic fundamental things that you and I get to do as citizens of our home countries. And that is limiting the potential of millions of people. Just a couple of weeks ago, we crossed this crazy milestone. And I don't want to fixate too much on numbers, but there are now over 100 million people forcibly displaced. And about 5.5 years ago, when I started getting involved in migration work, there were 62 million people forcibly displaced. And I say people who are forcibly displaced because that includes those we recognize as legal or formal refugees and those that are not. And this is one of the challenges with policies and words. We like to classify things and put people in categories and buckets and all kinds of things like that. The problem is when we start doing that, then you start cutting out the rights of other people. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the UN Refugee Convention of 1951, but it's definitely in need of an update. And by the definition, a refugee is a person who is outside his or her country of nationality, or what they call habitual residence. It means that they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted because of their race or their religion, their nationality, maybe their membership to a particular social group or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country or to return there for fear of persecution. So automatically you have this definition that you have to have crossed an international border to receive some of the protections that this convention affords you. And the rights that are supposed to be given to you as a refugee once you do cross is supposed to be, you're not allowed to be expelled. The US is already doing this, has been doing this for the last 3 administrations to people. The right to an education, freedom of religion, right to public assistance, to housing, the right to work, freedom of movement, access to the courts. It's a lot of nice things that in practice actually don't end up happening very often. But it also means that if you're displaced in your own country, which the majority of people who've been forcibly displaced actually are, and we're seeing increasing numbers of people displaced internally due to climate change, you don't have any of these rights and privileges, which makes for a very complex and challenging environment just from a humanitarian context. But I don't consider myself to be necessarily a humanitarian, but I do see a problem. And the problem is not that refugees exist. The problem is that the way that we respond to displacement is deeply flawed and insufficient and it's underfunded. So if people are displaced, last year, the humanitarian community, we're talking about the international NGOs, humanitarian organizations, and the donor agencies that largely support them. They were facing a massive budget crisis, as they have been year in and year out, because, again, going back to the duration of displacement and the sheer scale of how many people are displaced, it's really hard to pay for food and water, medicine, and basic security and shelter for these people year in and year out. To your point about burden, but it is a burden because we think about it only in the emergency context. And so all of the response and the funding that goes along with that is still under this premise that it's a short-term thing. If you think about this as something that is an emergency initially and then becomes a protracted or longer-term issue, then you need other resources. You need other creative ideas. You need other partnerships in place. And that does not manifest by itself. And that is why we started the Refugee Investment Network, was to sort of be a bridge to what we call durable solutions, to look at ways of supporting people who are on the move for different reasons, and the communities that are trying to support them and welcome them, with private and public finance and investment, through really strong and robust and sustainable economic development, by supporting entrepreneurs who need to start back up again when they've landed in a new place, and create pathways, and in a sense to normalize that, because this is the new normal, and the trend of people being displaced as we get deeper and deeper into the climate crisis is going to continue, unfortunately. But it doesn't have to be something that is so fraught with challenge and I think despair, because there are so many opportunities. And to your point, we do see refugees and displaced people not just as like an asset, but as partners. We want them to be able to contribute their ideas and their creativity and their ingenuity. We have a COVID vaccine because of immigrant creators. We have so many different things. I mean, if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, over half of them, almost half of them actually, about 44%, were founded by refugees, immigrants, or their kids. So you suddenly start to limit people's potential, and we are missing out on solutions and ideas that we are going to need to solve for poverty, to work on the food security issues of today and tomorrow, to help us come up with better and smarter ways of doing work in the world. I want those people on my team. I want them active in the arena, and I don't want them sitting on the sidelines or benched, which is basically what we're doing right now.
And so you believe that if you can work out the governance and compliance and legal issues of let refugees work when they, because I remember my parents were refugees. I mean, they fled from Poland to France, and then from France to Spain and Palestine, and then the U.S. And he always said, it doesn't really matter where you live as long as you can make a living. And so you're saying let them make a living.
Well, yeah, I'll give you an example. Not just because it's the right thing to do, because it is the smart thing to do for everybody. Mexico is not necessarily the place you think of when you think about the global displacement crisis. But it is a country that people are familiar with from a migration or mobility perspective. And over the years, we have seen larger numbers of people seeking refuge in Mexico. And Mexico is a complicated place. It's very nuanced. Different parts of that country are vastly different from others. You have, I think what the media like to talk about with very violent and dangerous parts, but you also have a place like Merida, which is the second or third safest city in all of North America. very different context there. And as the quality of life has been improving for all in Mexico over the last several years, it is becoming a more attractive place. At the same time, the United States, long thought to be this wonderful refuge for anyone, is becoming increasingly hostile, or at least has over the last 3 administrations, to immigrants and refugees. So it's becoming less appealing. What's happened is that you have had now larger numbers of people seeking asylum and refuge in Mexico. You have a large sort of national consciousness there that is still not confident enough about itself to think that people actually want to move there or seek shelter there. I think that's an interesting dynamic. When we were looking at the market there and understanding the ecosystem of displacement, most of the Mexican businesses and social entrepreneurs were not engaged in economic development for asylum seekers and refugees, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't think that there were enough people there for them to support and serve. Why? Because they didn't think that it was appealing enough for them to move there. But the numbers tell a very different picture. And they had a 4,000% increase in asylum applications over the last few years. And I think last year they had about 130,000 applications, which just going back 5 years ago, there were only about 4,000 to 8,000 applications. Big change. There is a program that the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has been piloting where they sort of offer a whole suite of wraparound services that help people who are seeking asylum economically integrate at an accelerated pace. Within 2 weeks of being approved for asylum, people are provided access to permanent housing. So we're not talking shelters here. We're talking a real place to live and stay. They're given a prepaid sort of cash card that gives them a little bit of cash flow runway for their first 6 months. They're given access to job matching services based on their skill sets and what the labor market is hiring for. They're given sort of a mentorship network, and their children, this is really important, are given access to the education system or to childcare. So if you think about the Ukraine context, most of the people fleeing, not all, but most, are parents with children, single parents, and in particular, women, right? They're moms with kids. And that's because the sons or the husbands have to stay behind by law to fight against Russia. So if you do not give someone a pathway to childcare education for their kids, the adult, the parent, has a very, very hard time seeking employment or starting their own business again. Childcare and education become what we call a social determinant of work. And I know people have talked about social determinants of health, but this is a key factor that either enables you to enter the workforce or not. So in Mexico, they recognize that that's a key thing. They put that into the early services, and UNHCR has successfully economically integrated fully thousands of people now over the last few years who are now paying more taxes than the entire cost of resettling them or giving them asylum in terms of the budget of Mexico's asylum agency, Comar. So it's just been a few years, but if you're just looking at the economic numbers there, the contributions are outweighing the cost. And we know this is the case. The United States has a long track record of tracking tax data. So again, you don't have to make the humanitarian argument, even though I think obviously this is the right thing to do, but purely by the numbers from an economic perspective, the contributions far outweigh the costs. In the US, we're looking at billions of dollars of contribution over the last 30 years of refugees. Investors know this when they start to learn about it. So, we look at rates of entrepreneurship. The refugees tend to have the highest rates of entrepreneurship as a percentage of their population than any other demographic group. It's not by accident. I think, yes, maybe there's something innate about going on a journey through hardship that positions you in a place that you maybe are ready to take more risks because you have nothing, literally nothing to lose. But it also is something that comes out of necessity because the traditional pathways to work are radically reduced for you because of all of the biases and policies that are in your way. So entrepreneurship becomes this natural path. We know that repayment numbers from a lending perspective, at both a consumer and a business perspective, are just as good for refugees as ordinary citizens. This, like, to me, this stuff is really basic. Like, it's the fact that I have to even share that, I think is frustrating. But the numbers are there now. But 5 years ago, if you were to run around the world looking for a microfinance institution, for example, just taking microfinance as an example, that was going to lend money to refugee entrepreneurs, you wouldn't have found one. And most of them felt like refugees were a flight risk. They're here temporarily. They're going home. Why would I provide lending capital to them to start a business when they might leave in 6 months? Why would they pay me back? I can understand the rationality, but that rationality is largely based by a lack of understanding, a lack of data, and bias. So thanks to some corporate philanthropists and some private foundations that we worked with, and Kiva, for really seeing what others did not, they were able to provide essentially like R&D capital to microfinance institutions at 0% interest to say, look, we want you to go out and test the market, even if you don't think it's going to work, even if you're going to lose every penny, and just see what happens and bring us back the data. And so they did that. They've now lent over $10 million to refugee micro entrepreneurs in over 7 countries. The repayment rates are on par, and in 5 countries, they're actually better than traditional customers. And that the performance of that from a financial perspective was so good that Kiva decided, and also the demand from capital providers looking for opportunities to invest and make an impact in the world, was so good that they decided to set up their first investment fund for accredited investors. Kiva has lent over $1 billion in capital all over the world for many years now. They've never offered anything for institutional investors or accredited investors. Big change for them. And they raised a $30 million fund pretty quickly. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation anchored that with a $20 million debt note. And that's off and running. And I think that's a really good example, while it's, in only one layer of the market, of what is possible when you see people as people and you recognize that they're just as able to contribute and be an economic partner of yours than anyone else. And what we want to do is see, 1,000 funds get off the ground at every layer of the market, in every market ecosystem, so that if you are a refugee or a displaced person and you're, landed in a new place, there is a path for you to pursue and the right kind of capital waiting to support you and unlock whatever gifts you have to contribute. Whether you're a job,
you still can't work. So you could provide them money, but the government won't let them work.
Well, it's the right to work issues are nuanced. So it isn't true that refugees can work everywhere in the world. It is also untrue that they cannot work in every country in the world. So different countries have different policies. Ukrainians, for example, the EU issued a pretty, I would say, innovative, if not biased, policy that grants all Ukrainians fleeing the conflict full work visas in the EU for at least an initial 3 years. Why they didn't do that for Syrians? Well, I think that's probably due to a number of xenophobic and racist policies. But Colombia issued 10-year work visas for Venezuelans for 2 million of them. Unprecedented. So they have the same economic rights and privileges in Colombia as Colombian citizens do. Jordan issued work permits for the first time in over 60 years of hosting refugees in the middle of the Syrian conflict. Now, they were very specific and gave work permits in only 3 major sectors: agriculture, construction, and home-based businesses. But the fact that those permits were issued at all created an opening of possibility. And different countries have different regulations. Ethiopia has the right to work. Turkey has the right to work and the right to entrepreneur as well. But again, there's nuance. So there are rights there, but you need to, as an entrepreneur, have a Turkish business partner or a Turkish co-founder. In Jordan, you can start a business as a refugee, but that business has to be incorporated under the ownership of a Jordanian national. So it is creating, in some ways, unintended social cohesion. It is also creating some sort of predatory type environments, but it's fluid. The policy environment, the regulatory environment, the right to work issue is not static. As I mentioned in Mexico, it's a very favorable legal environment. What we find sometimes is that there's compliance issues. So in Mexico, because I think it's a good example, there is a banking regulation that prohibits any bank from discriminating against refugees or asylum seekers. Right? So if you have the documentation provided by the Mexican state, anyone should theoretically be able to open a bank account and transact and participate in financial inclusion. But until this year, over the last 4 years and every year preceding that, not a single bank was in compliance with that. And it wasn't by design. They were not saying, okay, we're not going to give bank accounts to refugees. But it was a software issue. Literally, like, you go into a bank, you sit down with the banking, not the teller, but the new accounts representative, right? They're sitting in front of you at the computer, and they take your name. They ask, are you a Mexican citizen or non-Mexican citizen? Those are the 2 options. If you're a non-Mexican citizen, they ask you for your passport, so they can put the passport into the account. That's literally in the drop-down menu. Most asylum seekers and refugees, at least in Mexico, don't have passports. So at that moment, they say, you don't have a passport, we can't open your account, have a nice day. Now, aside from not being able to participate in, from a banking perspective, the other issue that comes up with that in Mexico is that if you want a job in the formal economy, a job that comes with health insurance, a job that gives you access to the education system, and a job that sometimes qualifies you for affordable government subsidized housing, you need a bank account to receive your payment from your employer, because all payments in the formal economy are done through direct wire. If you don't have a bank account, you literally won't be hired. And so the banking compliance issue became this barrier for giving people access to the economy, and which is why everyone was ending up in the informal economy and not having access to education, not having access to childcare, not having access to healthcare. And what did that do? It made them feel very uncomfortable and not safe in that new home, which then increases the likelihood that they want to go somewhere else, i.e. the US, creates more tension around the border. So today, actually it was about 2 weeks ago, Banorte, which is a relative of Citibanamex, decided that they're going to create a program to provide digital bank accounts, which works just like a regular bank account, but it's open. The bank account is open through an app. So if you have the government documentation that's issued to you as a refugee or asylum seeker, called a CORP in Mexico, it's kind of like a green card type thing in the US. And you have a name and you have $1 to put into your account, you can open an account. And that account works just as well as it does in a brick and mortar type setup. And in fact, you can start transacting through that as well. But That's the first bank that's done that, and hopefully others will follow. But Banorte had to understand that this was actually a problem, that there were over 2 million customers that they were not able to reach who wanted to transact financially. Now they see that, and they actually think of this as something that gives them a leg up on other banks in the Mexican marketplace, because they're a first mover. They're the ones that are going to open the door to financial inclusion to 2 million new customers. And by the way, those that are part of the UNHCR Economic Integration Program, they're already saving money. They're buying initially refrigerators. They're taking out loans to purchase cars. They're paying those loans back. These are very much viable customers. And I think what we want to see out there is that businesses, that policymakers, that investors, that financial institutions recognize that there are now over 100 million people out in the world who could be phenomenal partners, could be wonderful investees, who could be great customers of theirs that others aren't seeing. So the Refugee Investment Network, in a way, we do a lot of different things, but I think the most fundamental thing we do is actually help people see. It's like putting on a new pair of glasses and you're like, oh, aha. I've been blind or had a sort of a color blindness for most of my life, and now I can actually see rainbows and all kinds of awesome stuff.
So how many rainbows are you seeing in Europe? I don't see too many. My wife works at the refugee center at the airport, and she when she's allowed to, she tells me some of the horrors and the stupidity of the system, the way it's really set up. Do you see anyone in Europe that has an effective way of getting people out of a prison or refugee center into actually? They didn't move here to be in a refugee center. They wanted to create a life, obviously. Who in Europe is doing a great job in doing some of the things that you've just been talking about?
Well, so we developed something called the Refugee Investment Lens. It's a basic framework that would support what we call refugee lens investing. And it's not so dissimilar from gender lens investing in that it is a basic framework that is about intentionally investing and deploying capital in communities and in projects and businesses that support people who are displaced in different ways. When people think about refugee lens investing, they often think about it as just supporting refugee businesses and entrepreneurs, but it is also about businesses that are employing displaced people, businesses and deals that are going to provide products and services to the displaced as well. It could be, I talked about childcare, but it could be housing. I mean, really kind of meat and potato sectors from an investment perspective, but it could also be investing in hardware and technology that's going to radically transform humanitarian response and deployment, all kinds of interesting things. What I've seen in Europe so far is actually not coming from the capital community. What I have seen that has been promising there is really in the early startup environment, where you have incubators that have either developed specific programs tailored to the needs of migrants and refugees, or entirely new incubators that are really supporting and serving these communities. So in the UK, in London, you have Turn, which is the Entrepreneurial Refugee Network, and they are basically a startup incubator and accelerator. The challenge is that a lot of these businesses, because people are coming with their experience, right? They may not bring goods and assets and credit histories with them, but they are coming with their knowledge and know-how, and some of them have actually run very large companies in the past. These incubators and Singa is another one based in France, although they have outposts, I think, in Germany and Italy now, and elsewhere. They're doing a really great job at providing pathways for people to get off the ground, right? It's like the launch pad for a rocket ship. The problem is that most of these incubators and startup factories do not provide the rocket fuel. So awesome to have a launch pad and a place to get going, and they get off the ground, and then like a lot of other startups, like they face that horrible cliff of despair because they run out of resources, and there is not a dedicated pool of capital partners, whether public or private finance, to support them. And that's something that needs to change. We're actually seeing the Global South take a lead in doing that kind of work, in creating that kind of continuum of growth at every stage of the business journey. And I think it's largely because most of the displaced communities happen to still be in the Global South, despite what Europe might feel about the pressures of migration and things like that. The reality is that most refugees are still in the Global South. Most refugees prefer to stay home or as close to home as possible. They're not all trying to get to Europe, despite what some of our political friends or not friends in office might be saying. And so I think that what we need to do as a community, and one of the sort of takeaways, is help capital partners and businesses and other actors see their own agency in being able to build more successful, more sustainable, and more inclusive economies through the work that they already do. Right? And I've told you this, like, you know, I just mentioned this kind of rocket ship metaphor, but this is not rocket science. We are not talking about something that's extraordinarily complex here, even though the policy environment can feel like that. What we're talking about is you as an asset holder understanding that your resources, whether they are financial or investment or a business operation, has a fundamental role and opportunity, but that only happens if it's through intention. If you don't choose to say, okay, how can I use my fund? How can I use my holding company? How can I use these portfolio companies to be part of a more inclusive Paris or a more inclusive London or a more inclusive Copenhagen? It's not going to happen by itself. It's just not. So we have to give people a chance to see that agency. And once they do, then the question is, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we actually develop a strategy here? And so what we like to do as an organization is we kind of take a sort of a three-lensed view, and we do these kind of deeper assessments of a market or a city or a country, where we look at, of course, the demographics. Who's there? Where do they come from? What are their hopes, desires, and skills, and what are they bringing to the table? And what are the actual ground truth experiences that they're going through? What's the policy environment that either, you know, helps them flourish or is, you know, soul crushing in its complexity and barriers? Usually it's actually neither soul crushing nor total flourishing. It's kind of somewhere in the middle. And then what is the entrepreneurial business and investment ecosystem right now, and how connected is it to these demographics and these policies? And from that gives us literally like a snapshot in time to say, this is how inclusive this marketplace is as it relates to this demographic. And then from there, we can understand, okay, what do we need to adjust, fix, or improve that makes this ecosystem much more of an active partner to these people that have come and are seeking a new path. And usually that is how we end up developing new strategies or new funds. So in East Africa, for example, we're working with the Swiss government, specifically the SDC, the Swiss Development Corporation, the IKEA Foundation, and Acumen. We did a little bit of work for Acumen about 1.5 years ago, looking at their past deals and whether they were investing in different ways that would support refugees and displaced communities. The whole point of that was to give them a little sense that, well, actually, this isn't totally new. We've done this a few times, but it's been unintentional. So what would happen if we developed an intentional fund specifically to focus on conflict-affected populations in East Africa, for example? And how do we do that? And that is why the SDC and IKEA Foundation is helping to underwrite our research, which then will be the sort of building block for someone like Acumen to develop a fund around. But you have to have that deep knowledge.
I'm going to take some of the questions posed already. Steve wanted to know, great to see you here. How much capital do you feel could be deployed, and what would be your big ask from the impact or general investment community?
Good to see you, Steve, and a great question. I don't know what the total assets to like, what's the total market size? I know that there are 100 million people who are carrying opportunity with them. And I will give you an example of a market sized within a period of time. What does that mean? So the first 3 years that I was working in this space, right, the world of migration, refugees, and investment, there was a large investment group and foundation that had made a very public commitment to deploy $500 million to invest in refugees. And they were very explicit about using the word invest, not in the way that development organizations will say we're investing in something. What they really mean is funding. They brought their private equity group to the table and said, we're investing in real deals. We want to place $15 million at a time in different ticket sizes, starting at that level. We are expecting market-based returns. So we're looking for 18, 20 and up percentage internal rate of return. And they want these things on normal timelines. And by the way, we want them to have a big impact. So if we're investing in a company that is employing refugees, and the thesis is all about labor market access, then they wanted that company to have the majority of employees be refugees. They went to Jordan. It's a wonderful country. It's been incredibly welcoming. But that I told you that they issued work permits, but the permits had a lot of conditions on them and still do. So finding a business, never mind relating to refugees, but finding a deal in Jordan where you can park $15 million or more, you can get 20% IRR, the risks are relatively adjusted. That's hard. This is a small market, and it's an emerging one at that. You put in these requirements around a 51% workforce being displaced, and all of a sudden your pipeline goes to zero. And they sent maybe 6 different teams over the course of 3 years to interview all kinds of people, beat the bushes, try and find opportunities. And they came back with almost nothing. And they said, well, there's a big pipeline problem. We don't think that there's much of a space or a market here for us to actually deploy these $500 million, let alone 10. We spent 8 months in the market doing our analysis and looking at those 3 overlapping areas in the policy, the market ecosystem, and the demographics. And in that 8-month period, we found over $2 billion of investable deals. Now, it's not to say every one of those deals was going to offer you a ticket placement for 15 million and a 20% IRR, but some did. And the way that we developed that deal pipeline was by looking at the opportunities that existed on the market that we would classify as a refugee lens deal, truly things that will support these communities and the ones hosting them. But that was maybe a small piece of it, 10, 15% of that pipeline. The rest of it were deals that we saw opportunity in that could become a refugee lens deal with a little bit of intention and design. So that means there's a major infrastructure project here and there were no conditions in place for who they're hiring. Very easy to put something specific in there about who they put their tenders out to or how. We looked at funds that were working on inclusion, focusing on gender, for example, but didn't have anything relating to refugees or displacement. There's an enormous population of women refugees in Jordan who are highly skilled, who are looking for opportunities. And by the way, that gender fund was also looking at agriculture, was also looking at home-based businesses and the digital economy. So it's not a stretch for them to add in or extend their focus around inclusion. But it just wasn't something that was top of mind, and they needed a little help understanding how do you actually do this in a way that's compliant with the regulatory environment. So again, that's not a specific answer to your question in terms of a total global market size, but it is an example of what you can do within a 2-month period. 8-month period. So in 8 months, if we can find 2 billion in opportunities in Jordan, I can only imagine what we would be able to find in Europe if we had a little bit of time and resources behind us.
Beata wants to know, what's your biggest lesson learned over the past 5 years?
There's a lot. I think one is that this actually isn't hard. It doesn't have to be. People make it hard. It really just requires a little bit of courage and faith that it's possible. If you were a fund manager and you said to me, with authenticity, I want to invest my resources in a way that's going to support displaced communities, I guarantee you, and I don't throw guarantees out often, but I guarantee you we can figure out something for you to put your money into that's going to have a tremendous impact, regardless of where you're at, unless maybe you're a hedge fund. That might be the one thing that I would caution against. But that intention is maybe the most fundamental shift for an asset holder, whether you're a fund manager or an operator of a company. Like, if you have that intention, you can make it work. Airbnb did that, and they're doing a lot of good in terms of providing short-term emergency housing for people. That did not come from 8 months of thinking about how they can make this work and then announcing it. It came because they said, we're going to figure out how to make our business work in a more inclusive way, because that's important to us. We stand by that. And then they figured it out. And that's where, I sometimes tell investors, like, okay, if you want to do this, then do it, but don't give me a litany of excuses of why you can't. Let's figure out what needs to change. And sometimes, we have to work with the regulatory environment. We have to talk to government, but sometimes it means change your thesis. And I shared this with Robert when we were in Oslo. I said, sometimes your thesis is wrong, and you guys need to go back to the drawing board.
Most of the time, it's wrong.
Exactly.
This is an industry that burned $15 billion for 10-minute bicycle delivery for groceries like milk. Come on, Gorillas has already ran out of money. None of them make any money, but 15 billion went into that nonsense. So you're right about the thesis.
I think that, the other issue is that a lot of the things that seem like intentions, where people are voicing their support of something like this, or saying, we're going to go out and do this, where there are problems is when that is not sincere, to your point, comment, Julianne. And I think that was the case with this one group that I mentioned that went to Jordan and didn't find very much. And that's because they were not prepared to do what it takes to make it happen. And if the data isn't there,
they didn't leave the 5-star hotel. They were waiting for the deal to fall on the roof of the car as they drove under a bridge.
Right. Or they just, they're a little bit naive about what to expect. You can't invest in a place like Jordan without understanding that there's going to be more risk than if you're investing in New York City. It's a different marketplace. The most junior PE person should know that. But if you send a bunch of consultants down there and they're paid way too much, they're going to come back with excuses of why they need to continue to do their consulting work, not with solutions. But you shouldn't be sitting on panels saying, oh, we're going out and doing this, when you're not actually doing it. That drives me crazy.
Rocky wanted to know, what trend or collaborations are you most optimistic about that will respond with a sense of urgency, like next year or 5 years?
So in a weird way, I'm seeing more movement from government and government development finance agencies. It's not something that in a million years would have suspected. These are like big Titanic ships, but they understand that we have to change the way that we are responding to displacement and humanitarian crisis. They know that we need this bridge to go into more permanent development solutions, and that's not going to happen on its own. They also know that getting private investors really fired up about this isn't going to happen unless there's data and evidence and a little bit of a track record, and in some cases, probably some sort of de-risking mechanisms for them. So when I started this work, there weren't any governments even talking about this in this way. Now we have the US that has participated in 2 major refugee lens deals and is looking for more, even though they don't yet have a mandate to do it. We have the Swiss government, and you have the Japanese government, and you have interest from the Danes as well. So that to me is really promising. The Japanese were a client of ours over the last year. And as I understand it, the work that we did with them around refugee lens investing is also coming from this push to move all of their assets, all of their public assets, and incentivize private sector too, to move that into 100% impact. That's like, I mean, that's a wild idea for a national government to be considering. It shouldn't be wild because we need that. The urgency is intense, but they are starting to take the first steps to do that work now. And Japan happens to be hosting the G7 next summer. And if I think about gender lens investing and how in some cases slow it has been, and in other cases there have been moments, sort of fits of sprints where it has radically accelerated and then of course hit a slow point again. But one of those big sprints happened when the Gender 2X initiative was brought to the G8. And those other governments gave authority and empowerment to their development finance institutions to go out and intentionally source deals supporting women and girls. And so to me, this is an exciting opportunity where we might be able to put refugee lens investing and more inclusive finance right on the table with the G7 countries. But unlike in the past, where it's been global north telling global south, here's what we're going to do, and here's what you're going to do. The opportunity now is to do this in partnership with the global south and to take insight from those that are out front doing the work where it is needed most. And so we're working closely with the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing. In fact, we're helping them to establish a national advisory board in Jordan where this work will be front and center. But other national advisory boards of the Global Steering Group of Impact Investing are already doing this. It's a major part of the work in Colombia. The Turkish National Advisory Board has refugee livelihoods as one of their main pillars. They haven't yet designed a full program for that, but the fact that it's there, they've made that leap for intention. Egypt is coming on board with this, and the Japan NAB itself is really interested in inclusive investment and inclusive design. So I could see something where this constellation over the next 12 months, and we can have another check-in a year from now, find out what happened, where you have this kind of global partnership happening. The European national advisory boards aren't doing it yet, but why shouldn't they, right? It seems like this is a great opportunity to take a cue from our friends in the global south, to learn from them and to start building more inclusive economies at home.
Almost every company, at least in Europe, I think in the US, cannot find staff. Restaurants, hotels, airports, the lines are just ridiculous. Healthcare. So why is it that you've got all these people kind of waiting on the sidelines over here? How about letting me in? And that still has not motivated the government institutions to say, hey, they want to work.
Well, this is where immigration, we start to have stagnation in progress because of politics, and it's interesting because in some ways we're having more movement and progress around inclusive development, inclusive design farther away, but domestically, we're still in the metaphorical Stone Age. And in fact, I can speak only on behalf of my own country, not on behalf, but about. The Biden administration's policies are more or less a continuation of the Trump policies, despite a change in tone and a change in language. The policies are more or less the same. And in some cases, it literally is an extension of the same policies. And many of Trump's policies were an extension of Obama's policies. We often think about like what we hear and we're like, oh, big changes here. And there haven't been big changes. And a lot of that comes from politics and political stagnation. And that is where I do think that private citizens, private businesses, and private investment can actually take a leading role, supporting the work of civil society that's been working on and advocating for these changes for many, many years. For the first time in U.S. history, private citizens can now sponsor refugees. And it's not dependent on the state-only process. And that's modeled largely after the Canadian sponsorship model, which has been extremely successful. And I think this is the thing, like in some cases, like I am delighted to be surprised by the movement we're seeing from certain governments around more inclusive investment. But I am not counting on it. And this is where I think working with private citizens and individual investors and funds and just communities and businesses is what we should count on, and then be surprised when government decides to show up in the way that we need them to. Because I think just from a trend perspective, government it tends not to do that. So these are maybe more anomalies, but it is a trend I'm seeing. So that's where, we are seeing large multinational companies under the Tent Partnership do really interesting things around hiring, but this has to go beyond hiring. And this is really about using all of our resources and assets. If you are a company that produces something of value, you should be asking yourself the question of how can I share this value with people that are being locked out of the system?
Right.
Because that is fundamentally going to increase and improve your own value. So if you can do that work, you need to start with that question. And then if you need help, you can call us or any number of organizations. We are a small team. We're way overstretched. I often think about the Tolkien quote in Lord of the Rings when Bilbo, or it's not Bilbo, it's Frodo who's describing himself, or no, it's Bilbo describing himself to Frodo, that I feel like butter that's been scraped over too much bread. That's totally our team. And that's why we are training other firms to look at the world with a refugee lens and to be able to go out and develop this work. So if you're in the Middle East or North Africa, Expectation State is an amazing organization. We're working with OCA, Open Capital Advisors in Africa, both East and West Africa. We've had a lot of chats with our friends at Dahlberg. So if you want consulting and strategy advice, there are firms that are coming online with this as a practice. But there are also fund managers and peers that you can rely on as well. Small, early stage angel investors that are doing this work. There are impact structuring organizations like Coes Investments in Belgium that are doing really good work on this, or social finance if you want to look at more innovative finance type products. And it is a community of practice that is expanding, not as fast as I'd like, but the more people and communities that we can touch and talk to about this, like all of you, the more we can equip people with the tools that they can go out and do this work on their own. And that's the goal.
What can we do, those that are watching live and those who will watch the replay, which is it's only a small group that came to the live event, what can they do to help you?
Well, I think one is to raise your hand. We can't be everywhere by any means. None of us can all the time. So we need you to ask questions and say, what about? I need you to raise your hand and say, well, where is the voice of displaced people in this work or in this policy or in this issue? And to ask your peers at your firms or your other family members, if you're a family office, or your co-founders in your businesses, like, what are we doing to be more inclusive to the 100 million people that have been forcibly displaced, and what are we missing out on? Start with that question, and then if you all want to develop something as a practice, then either go out and do it or give us a call. What I would do is look at, we did a report which Robert can share, and that was with the Rockefeller Foundation about a year ago, and it was just a quick, I'll just drop it into the chat. It was a quick survey of how people were deploying refugee lens investing activities. And I say activities because it wasn't always about investing money or funding something or deploying resources. Sometimes it was about partnership. Sometimes it's about divestment and actually saying our assets have power, let's leverage that and reduce the harm. We also think about this, we think about three continuums. The continuum of capital, from grants to institutional, commercial investing, and everything in between. We think about the continuum of the market, from basic livelihoods programs that help people get on their feet, to microfinance, small and medium-sized businesses, funds, multinational companies, everything in between. And then the continuum of mobility. So the period at which someone is at risk of displacement or is in a fragile context, that's a great moment to provide them with support and intentional investment to offset that risk. We think about that as an investment in resilience. And a lot of times today and in the decades ahead, it's going to be from a climate adaptation perspective. So people are not so dependent on a single source of income. Like coffee growers in Central America, for example, you've got hundreds of thousands of people employed in this single sector. And that sector in that particular region is facing increased challenges due to leaf rust, which is exacerbated by climate change. It's only going to get worse. Last year, they lost 70% of their crop. If they have the same kind of crop fallout year in and year out, eventually that industry will collapse. And all of a sudden, you're going to have several million people on the move. What can we do to invest in their resiliency, either to improve the resilience of that particular industry or to provide them with secondary income opportunities that can support their well-being and thriving? Then we look at, so that's like pre-movement. Then there's that state of crisis when people are in flight or newly displaced. And that's really about investing in improvements to humanitarian service delivery and the capacity of it. So extending through, let's say, things like innovative finance, how we creatively finance the provision of food, water, shelter, medicine, security, et cetera, but also in how we do that work. And that's where we invest in technology companies, software companies, thinking about last mile delivery, technology that can be redeployed in new contexts. And a lot of times there are really brilliant founders who come up with wonderful services and technologies that just have no context of how that resource can be deployed in a humanitarian way. It is sometimes the investor's job to help their portfolio companies understand that there is an opportunity over here that they're not seeing. And that is where you can use your assets as a sort of a benevolent activist to expand the targeting of those services or technologies to improve outcomes for people who are in a displaced setting. And then there's everything that comes after, right? That's all of the economic integration work that I've been talking about. And I guarantee you there is an opportunity for you to do really good and meaningful work there.
We're coming toward the end, and I want to do a short round of virtual mixer. Before we start that, I'd just like to take a quick group selfie to prove to everybody that actually we were working today. And so, John, you're a vast, incredible inspiration, or as to paraphrase Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in Gunga Din, you're a better man than me, Gunga Din. I want to thank also Sam, our producer, crypto genius, and ramen critic, who is now moved to Asia, finally. Ricky, my absolute better half, who also left today to go to Ladakh. Xi Jinping, our head of transparency and integrity. Vladimir Putin, our president of the Mother Teresa School of Compassion. Elon Musk, our humility coach. Ted Cruz, our in-house mensch. And Recep Erdogan, the chairman of our Kurdish Cultural Heritage. Thank you all very, very much, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to run the virtual mixer, so just stick around. I don't know if we'll have enough people. There's at the 12 or 13 in the room at the moment, but we'll give it a try. And John, thank you. And please send me stuff that I can share with everyone who watched the live session or will watch the replay. So let's close this. Yes. Okay. And go right to the mixer. Okay. See you in a bit.
Thanks, everybody.